In the 1950s, more than 500 resorts, 50,000 bungalows, and 1,000 rooming houses spread across the Jewish Catskills, drawing roughly 500,000 summer visitors each year. By 1997, the What 200-room Concord had filed for bankruptcy with more than $9.5 million in debt. In 2013, Kutsher's, the last grand survivor, closed. This was not the failure of one hotel. It was the collapse of an American vacation empire built by people other resorts had refused to admit. Long before the Catskills became a Jewish vacation empire, the mountains already knew how to sell themselves. In 1824, the Catskill Mountain House opened on the eastern escarpment above the Hudson River, where steamboat passengers transferred to stagecoaches and climbed toward a white hotel overlooking miles of farms, villages, and water. Wealthy visitors came for the view. Painters came for the light. The mountain air itself became something that could be purchased by the week. But that was the eastern Catskills. The country farther south, through Sullivan County and parts of Ulster County, offered no comparable balcony over the Hudson. Here the mountains settled into wooded ridges, narrow valleys, lakes, streams, and fields interrupted by stone. Liberty, Monticello, Fallsburg, Ellenville, and the smaller settlements around them stood roughly 90 to 100 miles northwest of Manhattan, close enough to reach by train, far enough to feel removed from the brick and heat of the city. The distance would eventually become one of the region's greatest assets. At first, the land was supposed to pay. During the final years of the 19th century, Jewish immigrants were arriving in New York from Russia and Eastern Europe in enormous numbers. Many settled in the crowded neighborhoods of Manhattan, where work could be found in garment shops, factories, pushcart markets, and small trades. To Jewish philanthropists, agriculture appeared to offer another path: land, independence, physical distance from the tenement, and a form of labor that could not be taken away by a factory owner. The Baron de Hirsch Fund, incorporated in New York in 1891, supported agricultural education and helped Jewish immigrants establish farms. The Jewish Agricultural and Industrial Aid Society, founded in 1900 and later known as the Jewish Agricultural Society, extended loans, offered instruction, and encouraged settlers to organize cooperatives. Its purpose was practical, but the idea behind it was larger. A family that owned soil might own its future. Some of that future was purchased in Sullivan and Ulster counties because the land was affordable. It was affordable for a reason. Many of the new farmers had little agricultural experience. Even those who learned quickly faced thin, rocky ground that resisted the crops planted in it. A plow could strike stone where a field appeared smooth. Clearing land required cutting trees, pulling stumps, moving rock, and then discovering that the useful soil between them was still shallow. The Catskills could grow forests without assistance. Corn, wheat, and vegetables demanded negotiation. The settlers adjusted. Chickens required less fertile ground than grain. Cows could convert grass into milk. Eggs, poultry, and dairy products became more dependable than rows of field crops, and the railroad connected these farms to customers in New York City. The same valleys that made travel difficult provided routes for steel track. The New York, Ontario, and Western Railway passed through the southern Catskills and carried passengers, coal, milk, and other farm products between rural New York and the metropolitan area. By 1911, New York contained 14 of the 45 Jewish cooperative farm organizations then operating across the United States. Together, those New York cooperatives represented 1,004 member families. In 1912, the Jewish farming population of the state was estimated at approximately 7,000, concentrated largely in Sullivan and Ulster counties. That number is worth pausing over. This was not a handful of urban shopkeepers experimenting with gardens. Synagogues appeared beside dirt roads. Agricultural offices opened. Chicken houses, dairy barns, feed stores, cream routes, and farm cooperatives formed the working structure of a rural Jewish community. Yet the arithmetic remained difficult. Chickens needed feed. Cows needed hay through the winter. Milk spoiled. Eggs broke. A farmer could work every day of the year and still be defeated by poor soil, disease among the animals, or a price set somewhere beyond the county. The land offered independence, but it did not promise solvency. Then summer arrived. In New York City, heat remained trapped between brick walls and inside crowded apartments. Air conditioning did not exist as an ordinary household convenience. Open windows admitted noise, soot, and air that had already passed through another room. Doctors sometimes recommended country air to patients worried about tuberculosis and other illnesses. Families with money left for established resorts. Working families looked for something cheaper. The railroad had already solved the largest physical problem. A person could leave the metropolitan area and step off a train in Sullivan County without owning a horse or an automobile. The tracks that carried cans of Catskills milk toward the city could carry the milk buyer's family in the opposite direction. Railroad companies understood that passengers were another crop. They published summer guides listing hotels, boarding houses, farmhouses, lakes, and villages along their lines. In an 1899 guide issued by the New York, Ontario, and Western Railway, the Rock Hill Jewish boarding house in Glenwild advertised a newly furnished establishment observing Jewish faith and customs throughout. Its proprietor, J. Gerson, was selling more than bed. He was selling the assurance that a guest could arrive in the country and know how the kitchen operated, what food would be served, and how the household would observe its days. For a struggling farmer, the discovery was simple. A field might produce once a year. A bedroom could produce income every night of the summer. The vegetables from the garden could be served at the table instead of hauled to market. The eggs could be sold inside the house. A wife who already cooked for her family could cook for paying guests, while children carried bags, changed bedding, gathered produce, and met trains. The first additions were modest. Another bed, another table, another room enclosed beneath a porch roof. No one looking at those farmhouses could yet see the swimming pools, nightclubs, golf courses, and dining halls that would follow. They could see only that the soil would not pay. But the spare room did. In 1907, Max and Louis Kutcher opened a farmhouse near Monticello to summer boarders. The brothers had arrived in the United States only a few years earlier. They worked as tailors on Manhattan's Lower East Side, saved their money, and bought farmland with Max's wife, Rebecca. The name they placed on the business was plain enough: Kutcher's Brothers Farmhouse. There was no country club, no golf course, no nightclub. There was a house, a farm, and enough room to take in strangers. The Kutchers were following a pattern that had begun to appear across Sullivan and Ulster counties. Near Ellenville, Charles Slutsky started receiving summer boarders at the Nevelle Falls farmhouse sometime between 1901 and 1908. Early accounts placed some of the accommodations in a barn on his farm. Near Liberty, other families converted bedrooms, enclosed porches, or put small additions onto houses that had been built for agricultural life. The farmhouse was well suited to this early stage of the business. It already had a kitchen, a dining table, storage space, animals, and family members accustomed to working without fixed hours. The vegetables came from the garden. Milk, eggs, and chickens could come from the property or a neighboring farm. A guest did not expect an orchestra or a tiled swimming pool. A clean bed, regular meals, mountain air, and a household that understood Jewish religious practice were enough. That last requirement changed the economics of the room. A bed could be rented almost anywhere. A kosher kitchen could not be improvised for one visitor. Meat and dairy required separate handling. Ingredients mattered. The sequence of preparation mattered. Sabbath and holiday observance mattered. A farm family able to provide these things was not simply competing with another farmhouse down the road. It was serving a population for whom an ordinary country hotel might be unusable even when it was willing to rent the room. Much of the labor that made this possible belonged to women. Men might own the land, meet the train, tend animals, or make repairs, but the reputation of a boarding house was often established in its kitchen and dining room. Cooking for 10 or 20 paying guests was not an extension of an ordinary family meal. It meant purchasing, preparation, serving, washing, and beginning again, with beds and laundry fitted into the same day. Hospitality turned domestic labor into the most valuable department of the farm. No family demonstrated that transformation more clearly than the Grossingers. Asher Selig Grossinger left Austria for New York in 1897 and found work pressing coats on the Lower East Side. His wife, Malk, and their children joined him. Their daughter, Jenny, born in Galicia in 1892, left school young and worked in the garment trade. The family's move to the Catskills was supposed to improve both its income and its health. Records differ by a year, placing the purchase of their Ferndale farm in either 1913 or 1914. The property was known as Longbrook. It was inexpensive, run down, and no more cooperative than the other Rocky Catskills farms. The Grossingers had received assistance through the Jewish Agricultural Society, but instruction and credit could not alter the ground beneath them, so they rented the bedrooms. During that first season, the Grossingers hosted 9 guests and collected $81. The amount was small enough to fit inside an envelope. It was also evidence. 9 people had paid to sleep in a farmhouse that was failing as a farm. Malke Grossinger ran the kosher kitchen. Jenny greeted guests and learned what made them return. The arrangement did not separate family life from business. It laid one directly over the other. Guests ate food prepared by the family, occupied rooms inside the family's home, and were received not by a desk clerk in uniform, but by the people whose name would eventually appear on the building. Jenny understood that intimacy was not something the hotel would need to outgrow. It was the product. A returning guest could expect to be remembered. A complaint could reach an owner without passing through layers of management. If more people wanted to come, the answer was not a new branch in another city. It was another room attached to the same house. Lumber converted reputation into capacity. The system spread because it could begin with so little. One successful summer paid for paint, mattresses, or plumbing. Several successful summers could pay for an enclosed porch or a dining room addition. A farmhouse became a boarding house without a single moment when everyone agreed that its identity had changed. The barn remained. Chickens still scratched near buildings now occupied by vacationers. The word farm often stayed in the name long after the guests had become the most valuable thing the property produced. In 1919, only about 5 years after receiving those first 9 boarders, the Grossingers sold Longbrook and purchased a substantial portion of the nearby Nichols estate. The move separated the business from the physical limits of the original farm. The new property became Terrace Hill House and eventually Grossingers. Tennis courts, riding paths, organized activities, and a children's camp would follow during the 1920s. The same evolution occurred elsewhere. Kutcher's Brothers Farmhouse became Kutcher's Country Club. Slutsky's farm property became the Nevele. A name that once promised simple rural accommodation came to promise a complete vacation. Expansion required money, and money introduced another boundary. Many conventional financial institutions were reluctant to lend to Jewish hotel and bungalow owners. In Ellenville, the Home National Bank became one of the few banks willing to do so during the 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s. Its Neo-Georgian building, completed in 1928, stood at Canal Street and Main Street. Behind its brick walls, local deposits became hotel rooms, dining halls, and bungalow colonies. The first Jewish Catskills hotels were not constructed from master plans. They accumulated. A kitchen gained a dining room. A farmhouse gained a wing. A family hired neighbors, then cooks, waiters, chambermaids, and musicians. The business grew around the original household, like a town gathering around a railway station. By the beginning of the 1920s, the extra bed was no longer merely a way to rescue a farm. It was becoming an industry. The words appeared in advertisements, resort directories, and correspondence sent to travelers seeking rooms. No Hebrews or consumptives accepted. The sentence did not conceal its purpose. Consumptives were people suffering from tuberculosis. Hebrews were Jews. One was a medical condition feared for its contagion. The other was an ancestry and a religion. The advertisement placed them beside each other and left the prospective guest to understand the comparison. Other hotels used shorter phrases. Gentiles only, Christian clientele only. As public criticism increased, the language became less direct. A resort might promise a restricted clientele, advertise that churches were nearby, or require a recommendation from an existing guest. A reservation clerk could report that every room had been taken. The same room might become available when the next letter arrived bearing a different surname. The practice extended far beyond the Catskills. It appeared in Florida, Arizona, New England, the Adirondacks, and other resort regions where managers sold social separation as part of the accommodation. A hotel room included a bed, meals, and the assurance that certain people would not occupy the next room. One of New York's clearest examples stood at Lake Placid. Melville Dewey, who developed the decimal classification system used by libraries, also helped build the Lake Placid Club into a major private resort. The club excluded Jews and other religious and ethnic groups. Its rule allowed management to reject anyone who might be unwelcome to even a small minority of members, and it stated that exceptions for Jews were impractical, regardless of an applicant's personal qualifications. In 1904, prominent Jewish citizens petitioned the New York State Board of Regents to remove Dewey as state librarian because of his role in the policy. The regents publicly rebuked him, but declined to dismiss him. Dewey resigned the following year. The club continued excluding Jews. The lesson did not require a lawsuit. A Jewish family planning a vacation had to know where it could arrive without being turned away. Around 1916, the Federation of Jewish Farmers of America began publishing a Jewish vacation guide in English and Yiddish. The title explained the need with unusual precision: hotels, boarding, and rooming houses, where Jews are welcome. A vacation guide ordinarily told a traveler where the scenery was beautiful or the fishing was good. This one first had to establish where the traveler could enter the building. The 1917 edition urged readers to take a vacation for the sake of their health. Inside, families could choose among first-class hotels, boarding houses, farmhouses, or furnished rooms where they could do their own housekeeping. Many listings were in the Catskills. Advertisements mentioned kosher food, produce grown on the property, telephones, electric lights, and hot water. These were not decorative details. Each one answered a practical question asked by a city family considering several weeks in the country. One advertisement for the Bell House promised strictly kosher Hungarian cooking, along with music and dancing each evening. Other listings used the phrase dietary laws observed. Jewish readers understood it immediately. The same brochures that used churches nearby to warn one group away used the kitchen to invite another group inside. Word traveled through more than printed guides. The Yiddish press carried hotel advertisements. Synagogues, neighborhood organizations, relatives, and co-workers exchanged names. A satisfied boarder returned to the city and told another family which train to take, which station served the property, whether the rooms were clean, and whether the proprietor could be trusted. The result was a commercial network built from social knowledge. The customer often knew something about a Catskills farmhouse before seeing it. The owner knew what the customer expected before the train arrived. This gave the Jewish boarding houses an advantage larger than hospitality. They did not merely tolerate Jewish guests. They were organized around them. A family did not have to explain why certain foods could not share a plate or why Friday evening required a different rhythm. Holidays could be observed without negotiation. The kitchen, dining room, schedule, and staff already understood. That difference could be felt in something as small as entering the lobby. At a restricted hotel, a surname might invite inspection. At a Jewish farmhouse, it might reveal a shared neighborhood, a relative, or a previous guest. One building made the traveler prove that he belonged. The other began by assuming that he did. The system was not uniform. Some establishments were strictly observant. Others were culturally Jewish but less religious. Some catered to immigrant families who spoke Yiddish. Others sought younger, wealthier, and more Americanized customers. Price separated guests as surely as custom did. A room in a farmhouse was not the same product as a suite in an expanding hotel. But the scattered businesses shared the same market. Each refusal elsewhere sent another possible customer toward Sullivan County or Ulster County. Every family that learned where it was unwelcome also learned where its money had value. During the 1920s, the farmhouses multiplied, and the older ones added wings, dining rooms, recreation halls, and bungalow colonies. The properties competed with one another, but they also made the region more useful as a whole. A Jewish traveler no longer depended on a single accommodating proprietor. Entire villages contained choices. The discrimination did not disappear when the boarding houses became hotels. In 1957, decades after Kutchers and Grossingers had begun receiving guests, a National Anti-Defamation League survey found that approximately 1 in every 4 resort hotels in the United States routinely discriminated on the basis of religion. In parts of northern New England, more than half barred Jews. By then, the Catskills no longer offered a substitute room at the end of a train line. They offered their own country clubs, golf courses, swimming pools, orchestras, and stages. The customers who had once consulted a guide to discover where they could sleep could choose among hundreds of places built specifically to receive them. The hotels that said no had intended to preserve their own clientele. Instead, they delivered one to the Catskills. The number was 50,000. In 1953, the New York Times counted approximately 50,000 vacation bungalows in Sullivan County, spread among nearly 2,000 colonies. The same county contained 538 hotels and about 1,000 rooming houses, but the bungalows outnumbered them all. They stood beside lakes, behind farmhouses, along narrow roads, and in clearings cut into the trees. Most were small wooden cottages. A typical bungalow might contain 1 bedroom, a combined kitchen and living area, and a screened porch. The furniture was functional. The walls were thin. The kitchen could be close enough to the bed that breakfast occupied the entire building before anyone sat down to eat it. This was how most families experienced the Jewish Catskills. The grand hotels supplied the photographs, tiled pools, formal dining rooms, evening gowns, comedians beneath spotlights. Yet more than 80% of Catskills vacationers stayed in modest bungalow colonies, small hotels, and kucha lanes. They came because a season in the mountains could be made affordable if a family cooked its own food, occupied a simple building, and remained there long enough to justify the rent. The kucha lane came first. Its Yiddish name meant cook for yourself. During the 1930s, when the Depression made full hotel service impossible for many families, farmhouse rooms and small outbuildings were rented with access to a common kitchen. Each household supplied and prepared its own meals. In one such property near Monticello, 10 women shared a single kitchen during the 1950s. A surviving room later contained half a dozen ovens and refrigerators, the machinery of several households pressed together beneath one roof. Privacy ended where cooking began. The bungalow colony offered a little more separation. By the 1940s, families who could afford it increasingly preferred individual cottages with their own small kitchens. Several dozen bungalows might surround a lawn, a main house, a swimming pool, or a recreational building known as the casino. There was usually no gambling in the casino. The name belonged to the room, not the activity. During the week, it might hold mahjong games, card tables, children's programs, bingo, or a movie. On weekends, the tables could be moved aside for dancing. A piano, record player, or small band transformed the same plain building from nursery to nightclub. The Catskills bungalow was not rented for a weekend. July and August formed a separate domestic calendar. Mothers and children moved up for much of the summer, while fathers commonly remained in New York City to work. The men returned on Friday by train, bus, or automobile, carrying city paychecks into communities that had spent the week operating largely without them. On Sunday, they went back. Each weekend produced a small migration. Cars filled the roads. Buses stopped in towns where hotels and colonies had arranged transportation for guests. Suitcases, newspapers, food, and clean work clothes moved in one direction. Fathers who had slept 2 nights in the country moved in the other. The bungalow colony was a family vacation, organized around the fact that one member of the family could not take a vacation. For the women who stayed, the arrangement contained both freedom and work. They still cooked, washed clothing, watched children, and kept the bungalow in order, often without the domestic assistance some might have had in the city. But the work unfolded among other women performing the same tasks. Doors remained open. Children crossed from one cottage to another. A mother could ask a neighbor to watch a child while she went to the store or joined a mahjong game. Colonies formed committees. Residents arranged softball games, mahjong tournaments, dances, and children's activities. They also settled arguments among the children and disagreements among the adults. A cluster of rented cottages acquired rules, alliances, rivalries, and memories within the first weeks of the season. It became a temporary village. For children, the physical limits were easy to understand. The road, the trees, the lake, the casino, and the last bungalow marked the edge of the world. Inside it were dozens of playmates within shouting distance. There were games on the grass, swimming, small errands, and hours that did not have to be organized by an adult. The buildings were crude compared with the great hotels, but the colony offered something a hotel corridor could not: a settlement scaled to childhood. The owners operated on narrow seasonal arithmetic. Rent from 8 summer weeks had to maintain roofs, plumbing, roads, pumps, kitchens, and recreation buildings through 12 months of weather. A new pool might determine whether families returned the following year. A leaking roof or failed water system could consume the profit from several cottages. The property might still contain a chicken house or barn from its agricultural past, but the dependable crop now arrived with luggage. Local businesses adjusted to this rhythm. Grocers, butchers, bakeries, laundries, repair shops, and entertainment halls depended on a population that appeared each summer and disappeared before autumn. Town streets that were quiet in winter filled with shoppers. Farm roads acquired painted signs bearing family names and promises of pools, lakes, hot water, or modern kitchens. The bungalow colonies also gave the Catskills a social density the map could not show. Families from the same Bronx apartment blocks or Brooklyn neighborhoods might rent near one another. Other colonies drew strangers who returned to the same cottages every summer until the place felt inherited. Children grew taller against the same porch posts. Teenagers who had once shared games met again at dances. Marriages began in communities whose buildings stood empty for most of the year. By the 1950s, roughly 500,000 people were entering this summer world each year. They did not all receive room service. Most carried groceries, made beds, shared stoves, and listened through bungalow walls thin enough to make every neighboring family part of the evening. The number 50,000 described buildings. What it created was a city that appeared every June, lived for 8 weeks, and folded itself away in September. At Grossinger's, a guest could arrive by airplane, sleep beneath the same roof as more than 1,000 other vacationers, swim indoors, ski outdoors, play golf, see a nightclub show, and mail a letter without leaving the property. The resort had its own airstrip and its own post office. Those were not decorative claims printed in a brochure. They were working parts of a place that had begun with 9 boarders sharing rooms in a Catskills farmhouse. In 1919, the Grossinger family sold Longbrook House and purchased the former Nichols estate near Ferndale, roughly 100 acres, with a large house set above the surrounding fields. They renamed it Grossinger's Terrace Hill House. The new property offered more rooms, but it also offered something less visible: space. Space for tennis courts and riding paths, for additional wings, cottages, kitchens, dining rooms, staff quarters, and whatever the next season might require. Jenny Grossinger understood that expansion could not feel like machinery. The families arriving from New York City wanted clean sheets, abundant meals, and relief from tenement heat, but they also wanted recognition. Jenny remained the human face of the operation as the buildings multiplied around her. A guest was not entering an institution. A guest was being received. That distinction became harder to maintain with every new room. During the 1920s, Terrace Hill acquired tennis courts, horseback riding, organized games, and activities for children. The farm boarding house was being replaced by the resort schedule, a daily arrangement in which breakfast led to exercise, exercise to lunch, lunch to cards or swimming, and dinner to dancing. The bell, the dining room, and the activity board began to regulate time more efficiently than any plow or milking stool ever had. The architecture grew the same way. It did not appear from a single blueprint. Buildings were added, enlarged, connected, and remodeled as money and demand allowed. The older country house forms remained beside Tudor-style additions and later modern rooms of glass, stone, metal, and electric light. Walking through Grossinger's could mean passing from one decade into another without stepping outdoors. After the Second World War, the scale changed again. Returning servicemen married. New families moved into apartments and suburban houses. Paid vacations became more common, automobiles more available, and the Catskills stood within a day's drive of the largest Jewish population in the United States. Grossinger's answered with more beds, more recreation, and more reasons for guests to remain on the grounds. There were indoor and outdoor swimming pools, a golf course, skating, skiing, tennis courts, riding facilities, theaters, children's programs, and rooms large enough to feed or entertain crowds that would once have filled an entire village. A family that had been told it was unwelcome at hotels elsewhere could now spend a week inside a resort complex so complete that the outside world became almost unnecessary. Summer, however, was not enough. A property of that size could not simply be folded away when the leaves fell. Roofs remained over hundreds of rooms. Pipes had to be kept from freezing. Kitchens, corridors, boilers, and staff all waited for another paying season. Grossinger's needed winter. Snow was less dependable than the buildings. In 1952, the resort installed what is generally described as the first major commercial snowmaking system. Water and compressed air were forced through equipment designed to produce snow when the sky would not provide enough. The invention did not change the Catskills climate. It changed the hotel's relationship with it. A poor winter no longer had to mean an empty ski hill and unused rooms. The mountain boarding house that had once depended on weather for crops was now manufacturing weather for guests. Artificial snow extended the calendar, but the larger achievement was the system surrounding it. The skier needed equipment, instruction, meals, heat, entertainment, and a bed. The golfer required trimmed fairways and maintained greens. The swimmer needed filtered water, tiled changing rooms, towels, and attendants. Children required supervision. Nightclubs required musicians, tables, kitchens, lights, and waiters. Each pleasure rested on a hidden structure of labor. Grossinger's became a place where scale concealed itself. A vacationer saw a clean pool. Somewhere behind the wall, pumps were working. A guest saw dinner arrive. Somewhere beyond the swinging doors, meat was being prepared under kosher supervision for a dining room that seated well over 1,000 people. A letter disappeared into the resort post office and entered the national mail. Small conveniences were supported by a machine spread across hundreds of acres. Even a rival had been absorbed into the property. The private airstrip allowed small aircraft to land near the hotel, shortening the distance between the Catskills and the people who could afford to cross it by air. The post office carried the opposite movement. Postcards, letters, and packages leaving the resort, physical evidence sent back to city apartments and suburban homes. By the time Jenny Grossinger died in 1972, accounts described a resort of approximately 35 buildings spread across roughly 1,200 acres, receiving as many as 150,000 guests in a year. The farmhouse had not merely acquired extra beds. It had grown roads, recreation, dining halls, mechanical systems, an airstrip, and a federal counter through which its mail could pass. Every addition made the grounds more complete. Every addition also had to be heated, repaired, staffed, cleaned, insured, and filled again the following season. For the moment, the rooms were filled. Cars came up from the city. Airplanes touched down beside the hotel. Behind the post office counter, letters bearing news of the vacation empire began their journey home. At the Concord, the main dining room could seat as many as 3,000 people. A population larger than many Catskills towns gathered beneath one ceiling for dinner. When the doors opened, waiters moved between long ranks of white-covered tables, carrying soup, fish, meat, vegetables, bread, and desserts. Glasses struck saucers. Chairs scraped the floor. Orders crossed in the aisles. The room did not merely serve a crowd. It fed one all at once. The Concord had grown from a boarding house called the Ideal House into the largest resort in the region, with more than 1,000 guest rooms spread across its property at Kiamesha Lake. Its dining room was built on the same principle as its hotel wings. If the guests kept coming, the building would keep expanding to receive them. By the peak years, dinner required a room roughly the length of a football field. Food was included in the structure of the Catskills vacation. Guests did not leave the grounds to search for a restaurant, compare prices, or settle a check after each meal. They were assigned tables, often with the same waiter for the duration of their stay. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner divided the day as firmly as the activity schedule. Between them came snacks, coffee, tea, and visits to the hotel's smaller food counters. The menu was not designed to narrow a decision. It widened it. A surviving dinner menu from Kutcher's offered 11 main courses. There might be boiled flanken, potted brisket, chicken cacciatore, stuffed cabbage, or ribs of beef. Before the main course came juice, fruit, herring, soup, or gefilte fish with red beet horseradish. Afterward came apple strudel, fruit sherbet, raspberry gelatin, sugar bow ties, and whatever else could still be placed on the table. A guest could ask for more than one main course. A second plate might arrive as a side dish, although there was nothing small about it. The waiter's task was not to explain restraint. It was to keep the dishes moving. This abundance became one of the resort's signatures, but it had begun with a practical advantage. Jewish travelers could find food prepared according to Jewish dietary laws without bringing their own provisions or negotiating with a kitchen that did not understand them. At Grossinger's, the operation included separate facilities for meat and dairy meals. Pots, dishes, utensils, work surfaces, and ingredients had to remain divided. Feeding one family in a kosher home required attention. Feeding more than 1,000 guests required architecture. Behind the dining room were kitchens hot with steam, stockpots, ovens, carving stations, baking racks, dishwashing equipment, and separate chains of preparation. Bakers worked before breakfast. Fish had to be portioned, chickens roasted, briskets sliced, vegetables peeled, soup kept hot, and cold dishes held until the doors opened. When one meal ended, the room had to be cleared and reset before the next one could begin. The guests saw the plate. The hotel carried the weight behind it. Much of the food had traveled with Jewish families from Eastern Europe: borscht, kreplach, kasha varnishkes, pickled herring, blintzes, gefilte fish, flanken, and kollant. In city apartments, these dishes belonged to crowded kitchens, family recipes, religious observance, and whatever ingredients could be afforded. In the Catskills, the same foods emerged from hotel kitchens by the tray and platter. The transformation was physical. A bowl of cold beet borscht became one course among many. Brisket that might have anchored a family supper became one choice on a printed menu. Strudel arrived after a meal that had already included appetizers, soup, fish, meat, and vegetables. Foods associated with careful household use appeared in quantity large enough to survive refusal. That gap mattered. Many of the adults sitting at those tables had grown up in immigrant households, passed through the Depression, or lived through wartime rationing. Now a waiter stood beside them, prepared to bring another entree because the first selection no longer seemed sufficient. No speech was required. The dining room also arranged the social life of the resort. Head waiters decided where guests sat, and a table assignment could determine whom a person spoke to for the next week. Families returned to the same sections, and sometimes to the same waiters year after year. Singles watched the room with a different purpose. In the 1960s, Grossinger's head waiter described the pressure of placing unmarried men and women who had only a weekend to meet someone before returning to New York. Children were often sent to separate dining rooms, where smaller chairs did little to reduce the noise. Parents could eat without cutting meat, wiping spills, or negotiating over vegetables. For the children's waiters, the arrangement concentrated every dropped spoon and overturned glass in one place. The great dining rooms depended on labor that was easy to overlook once the tablecloths were straight. Cooks, bakers, dishwashers, busboys, waiters, captains, and head waiters turned the meal into a sequence, precise enough to repeat 3 times a day. Some workers returned season after season. Regular guests knew their names, and waiters learned which table wanted extra herring, which child would eat only chicken, and which couple expected another pot of tea before asking. A good meal could bring a family back the following summer. A disappointing one could send them to another hotel. Pools could be enlarged, rooms redecorated, and entertainers replaced, but the dining room faced judgment several times every day. Then dinner ended. Plates were cleared, chairs pushed back, and 3,000 guests began moving toward the lounges and theaters. At the Concord, tables were reportedly supplied with small noisemakers that guests could strike to show approval during the music. Neil Sedaka remembered that after dinner, some people had eaten too much to clap, so they knocked on the tables instead. At Grossinger's, the Terrace Room nightclub stood beneath the main dining room. Thousands of plates had been carried across the floor overhead before the band began below. Then the tables upstairs emptied, the corridors filled, and the same guests descended toward a stage where singers, dancers, musicians, and comedians were waiting to earn their attention. The hotel had stacked appetite above entertainment. The terrace room grew as Grossingers grew. In 1949, Morris Lapidus renovated and enlarged it during one of his earliest resort commissions. Lapidus understood that vacation architecture did not have to resemble daily life. Curves, concealed lighting, polished surfaces, and theatrical entrances could make a hotel in Sullivan County feel closer to a Manhattan nightclub or a Miami Beach fantasy. The room was not an accessory to the resort. It was one more reason to book it. Entertainment in the Catskills had begun on a smaller scale. Early boarding houses brought in musicians, staged amateur nights, or cleared furniture for dancing. A piano, a violin, and someone willing to tell stories could fill an evening. As hotels competed for guests, those evenings became scheduled productions with orchestras, costumes, lighting crews, printed programs, and performers whose names appeared in newspaper advertisements. Before many comedians reached the stage, they worked among the guests. The Catskills called such a person a tumbler, a word derived from Yiddish for someone who stirred things up. The tumbler organized games, led dances, introduced acts, encouraged shy guests, filled quiet afternoons, and prevented a rainy day from becoming a reason to leave early. He might referee a pool contest in the morning, lead Simon Says after lunch, dance with unattached guests at night, and perform comedy when the scheduled act was late. There was no backstage protection. The audience surrounded him all day. In 1942, a young Melvin Kaminsky worked at a hotel near Ellenville as a drummer and part-time tumbler. He later became Mel Brooks, but the earlier job required more than jokes. One routine sent him onto a diving board, wearing a derby and an alpaca coat, carrying suitcases weighted with rocks. He announced that business was terrible, jumped into the pool, and depended on the lifeguard to pull him and the suitcases out. It was physical comedy performed in wet clothing for people who would see him again at dinner. That closeness made the Catskills a severe place to learn. A theater audience in New York might never meet the performer again. At a resort, the comic could fail at night and encounter the same guests beside the swimming pool the next morning. There was no distance between the act and its verdict. The audiences were not passive. They talked, interrupted, recognized familiar material, and expected the performer to understand the room. If a joke failed, the silence arrived immediately. If it worked, the comic could change a word, shorten the setup, and try the improved version at another hotel. The abundance of resorts created a circuit. A performer could travel from one property to the next, sometimes playing several Catskills stages within a short engagement. The rooms varied from modest hotel casinos to nightclubs holding more than 1,000 people, but the work remained the same. Enter cold, read the audience, and establish a rhythm before patience disappeared. That pressure favored speed. Long explanations were dangerous. A complaint, a family argument, a doctor's visit, a hotel bill, or an anxious mother could be compressed into a few lines. The subject matter was recognizable because performer and audience often came from the same neighborhoods, heard the same accents, ate the same food, and understood the same tension between immigrant parents and American children. The humor could be sharp, affectionate, impatient, and self-directed in the space of a single sentence. Henny Youngman worked as a musician and tumbler before becoming known for one-liners delivered with a violin nearby. Sid Caesar, Danny Kaye, Jerry Lewis, Carl Reiner, Mel Brooks, Buddy Hackett, Jackie Mason, Joan Rivers, Rodney Dangerfield, Don Rickles, and many others passed through the Catskills circuit at different stages of their careers. Some developed acts there. Some arrived after they were already known. The hotels did not create every performer whose name appeared on their marquees, but they gave them concentrated audiences and repeated chances to work. The stages also produced stories of discovery, although even discovery could be arranged. In 1949, the young singer Eddie Fisher appeared at Grossinger's, where the established entertainer Eddie Cantor heard him and helped bring him onto national radio. The event was presented as a lucky encounter. A famous man happened to hear an unknown voice in a mountain hotel. Later accounts described careful work by Grossinger's publicity director behind the meeting. The discovery was real. The accident was managed. Fisher soon had national recordings and a television career. Others moved from hotel nightclubs into radio writers' rooms, Broadway theaters, Las Vegas showrooms, motion pictures, and the television sets appearing in American living rooms. The comic timing developed before resort audiences traveled with them. So did the characters, complaints, pauses, and rhythms. At the peak, the hotels could also bring the national stage back to the mountains. Grossinger's booked major singers and comedians. Brown's became closely associated with Jerry Lewis. At the Concord, the Imperial Room held approximately 3,000 people, matching the scale of the resort's enormous dining operation. Judy Garland, Tony Bennett, Barbra Streisand, and other nationally known performers appeared on Catskills stages. A guest could eat breakfast with 1,000 strangers, spend the afternoon beside a championship boxer or television comedian, and watch a major nightclub act without leaving the hotel grounds. If you had stood in the terrace room after midnight, the dining room above would have been dark. The dishes had been washed. The tablecloths had been changed. Beneath that silent floor, a comic was still measuring the distance between one line and the next. Then the room broke open with laughter. In July 1964, the Civil Rights Act became federal law. Its second title guaranteed equal access to hotels, restaurants, theaters, and other public accommodations without discrimination based on race, color, religion, or national origin. A hotel could no longer legally place "No Hebrews" in an advertisement or reject a family because its surname sounded Jewish. The law did not empty the Catskills dining rooms overnight. It removed one of the walls that had helped fill them. Religious discrimination did not vanish when the president signed a document, and private clubs retained ways to control membership. Yet the boundaries of American travel were changing. Hotels that had once treated Jewish guests as a category to exclude began accepting their reservations. Resorts in Florida, New England, and the West wanted customers with money to spend. Cruise lines wanted passengers. Airlines wanted every seat occupied. For the first generation of Catskills visitors, returning to the same hotel had offered protection as well as pleasure. They knew the kitchen, the owners, the waiter, the rules, and the other families. Their children inherited the reservation, but not always the need behind it. They had grown up speaking English, attended American colleges, entered professions, moved into suburbs, and married people whose families had different vacation traditions. The Catskills had built a complete world because the larger world had been closed. Now completeness could feel like confinement. Another change took place inside the city apartments the resorts had been built to escape. Room air conditioners became increasingly common after the Second World War. The summer heat of New York did not disappear, but a metal box fitted into a window could lower the temperature of a bedroom without moving an entire household 90 miles north. For bungalow families, the old arrangement also required time. Mothers and children might remain in Sullivan County for 8 weeks, while fathers drove up on weekends. As more married women entered paid employment, and more families settled in houses with yards, refrigerators, televisions, and air-conditioned rooms, the long summer migration became harder to maintain. A 1-week vacation asked for a different destination than a 2-month relocation. The automobile first appeared to solve the Catskills transportation problem. Old Route 17 had been overwhelmed by summer traffic, its 2 lanes carrying streams of cars through towns and around tight mountain curves. Construction of the limited-access quickway began in the 1950s, and by 1968 a continuous expressway crossed the region between Harriman and Binghamton. The new road shortened the trip from New York City. It also gave drivers an exit. A family traveling by train had boarded for a particular station, often one linked to a particular hotel. A family in a car could change its plans. It could stop for a night, continue north, turn toward New England, or drive south until the mountains gave way to warmer air. The highway delivered guests to Sullivan County more efficiently, but it did not require them to remain there. Above the highway, the scale of distance was changing even faster. On October 26, 1958, a Pan American Boeing 707 left New York for Paris carrying 111 passengers. After a refueling stop, it reached France in about 8 hours. The trip from Manhattan to the Catskills could consume much of a Friday evening in traffic. Europe now fit within a night. Air travel remained expensive for many families during the early jet years, but larger aircraft steadily reduced the cost of carrying each passenger. The Boeing 747 entered service in 1970 with more than twice the capacity of the early 707. After airline deregulation began in 1978, carriers gained greater freedom to set fares and routes. Competition intensified, and long-distance travel became available to more of the middle class. A Catskills hotel could manufacture snow. It could not manufacture an ocean. Florida had already shown what happened when Jewish vacationers gained access to warm-weather resorts. In 1945, the Grossinger family purchased a formerly restricted Miami Beach hotel, installed a kosher kitchen, and advertised Passover packages. The family did not keep that property for long, but the transaction placed two eras beside each other. The people who had built a mountain refuge were now carrying their hospitality into a resort that once might have refused them. Miami Beach, the Caribbean, California, Europe, and cruise ships offered unfamiliar streets and warmer winters. Many also offered kosher food, Jewish religious services, or enough nearby Jewish residents to make travel practical without recreating an entire Catskills hotel. The large resorts tried to follow the change. They enclosed swimming pools, added air conditioning, expanded golf courses, pursued conventions, scheduled singles weekends, and promoted winter programs. Grossinger's broadened its clientele. By the early 1960s, reports suggested that a substantial share of its guests were no longer Jewish. The Concord marketed itself as an all-year, all-sports resort. Those adjustments kept the largest properties working long after many smaller establishments had begun to fail. But each improvement required more capital, and each new wing increased the number of rooms that had to be filled. A bungalow owner could close several cottages. A hotel with towers, kitchens, theaters, indoor pools, boilers, and golf courses carried its empty space differently. The decline therefore arrived unevenly. Some boarding houses disappeared in the 1950s. Bungalow colonies and small hotels began losing families during the 1960s. The largest resorts continued to present crowded holiday weekends and famous entertainers, even while the ordinary weeks between them became harder to sell. From the lobby, the old system could still appear intact. The chandeliers remained lit. Dinner was announced. A comedian walked onto the stage. Cars continued to leave New York on Friday afternoon, but other families were driving toward an airport. In the Catskills post office, postcards had once departed bearing pictures of Grossinger's swimming pools, golf courses, and broad hotel wings. Now cards were arriving from Miami Beach, San Juan, London, and Paris, sent by the children of the guests who had mailed the earlier ones. The address in Sullivan County had not changed. The distance around it had. By the 1970s, the Concord still possessed the physical equipment of a vacation empire. 12-story guest wings, 3 golf courses, an indoor pool, convention halls, shops, kitchens, and an entertainment room large enough for 3,000 people. What it no longer possessed was a reliable supply of vacationers willing to fill them. The hotel had been built to absorb crowds. Now it had to survive the spaces between them. Management pursued conventions, religious retreats, singles weekends, automobile shows, holiday packages, and winter programs. A full convention could briefly restore the old machinery. Buses pulled in. The kitchen heated its ovens. Elevators climbed through the guest towers. The imperial room filled with voices again. Then the event ended, and 1,200 rooms remained. Across the Catskills, hotel owners and public officials began looking toward gambling. A casino promised something the traditional resort schedule could not. Customers arriving throughout the year, indoors, regardless of weather. Slot machines required no snow. Card tables did not care whether families still wanted 2 weeks in a bungalow. The hotels already had beds, dining rooms, theaters, parking lots, and roads. Gambling appeared to be the missing engine. New Jersey moved first. In November 1976, voters approved casino gambling within Atlantic City. Resorts International opened the first casino there on May 26, 1978, and crowds waited outside to enter. Atlantic City was closer to much of the same northeastern population the Catskills hoped to recover, but it possessed an ocean, a boardwalk, and legal casino tables. Cars that might once have traveled north on Route 17 could now travel south. New York's Constitution prohibited the kind of casino gambling Sullivan County wanted. Changing that required state legislation, constitutional procedures, public votes, negotiations, and political support that repeatedly appeared and disappeared. Casino proposals became a recurring feature of Catskills development plans. Renderings showed new towers, gaming floors, conference centers, and restored resorts. Each plan placed future revenue beside present decay. The Concord continued operating while the arguments moved through Albany. Its owners had reason to wait. The hotel's enormous physical plant could not easily be reduced to a small country inn. A 3,000-seat room was valuable when 3,000 people came. Empty, it remained a 3,000-seat room requiring a roof, heat, wiring, insurance, and maintenance. Gambling offered a way to make the scale useful again. Grossingers stopped waiting in 1986. The family sold the property, and the main hotel closed. New owners announced redevelopment, but reopening a resort spread across dozens of buildings proved more expensive than buying it. The golf course survived. Much of the hotel did not. The Concord held on for another 12 years. In January 1997, New York lawmakers rejected a casino referendum on which the hotel's owners had placed considerable hope. The next month, the Concord entered Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. It owed Sullivan County approximately $8,700,000 in property taxes, plus roughly another $250,000 in room taxes. The county that had once collected revenue from packed hotels was now the hotel's largest creditor. The Concord remained open during the bankruptcy, still serving guests beneath chandeliers and sending golfers onto the monster course. Investors discussed turning it into a smaller, more expensive spa and golf resort. One proposal called for removing hundreds of rooms and raising rates. The old hotel was not considered worthless. It was considered too large for the business that remained. In 1998, the Concord closed. The doors that had admitted generations of families were locked, and the contents of the hotel were sold. Furniture, lighting, kitchen equipment, linens, and pieces of a resort built over decades were separated from the rooms they had served. A chair designed for one place entered another. Silverware that had crossed the dining room disappeared into boxes. The building remained. At a bankruptcy auction in 1999, the property sold for approximately $10,250,000, a fraction of the money required to reproduce its towers, pools, kitchens, theaters, and golf courses. New owners announced a succession of ambitious projects. A $500 million resort was proposed. Later came plans for a $750 million hotel and casino, then a $600 million project associated with Mohegan Sun. Ground was broken, agreements shifted, lawsuits followed, financing changed. The casino remained mostly on paper. New York permitted video lottery terminals at selected racetracks, and in 2004 electronic gaming arrived at Monticello Raceway. The machines looked like slot machines, but the facility was not the full casino Sullivan County had been seeking. It gave the region gambling without giving the Concord a second life. By then, the closed hotel had become useful for other purposes. Firefighters trained inside its empty concrete and steel structure. Rooms once prepared for vacationers became spaces where crews could practice entering smoke-filled corridors. Water-damaged ceilings. Weather entered through broken windows. The building survived because it had been constructed to hold enormous crowds, though the crowds were gone. Demolition began in 2008. The guest wings came down. The Imperial Room disappeared. The football field-sized dining room that had seated 3,000 people became broken concrete, cable, steel, and dust. The casino proposals continued after the hotel they were supposed to rescue had been removed. In November 2013, New York voters finally approved a constitutional amendment allowing the legislature to authorize as many as 7 commercial casinos. The following year, the state selected the Montriane proposal for the old Concord grounds in the town of Thompson. Construction followed where earlier plans had stalled. On February 8, 2018, Resorts World Catskills opened on the former Concord property. Its 18-story hotel contained 332 suites. The casino floor covered approximately 65,000 square feet, with more than 2,000 slot machines and over 100 table games. After nearly half a century of proposals, Sullivan County had the full casino its resort owners had imagined. It arrived 20 years after the Concord closed and 10 years after the hotel was demolished. At night, the new tower rose above the old resort grounds in glass and electric light. Inside, cards moved across green felt and machines sounded at the touch of a button. Somewhere beneath the roads, lawns, and new construction lay the footprint of a dining room built for 3,000 seats. The hotel had waited for gambling. Gambling had not waited for the hotel. Inside a former bank in Ellenville, a 12-foot-long neon sign glows above a museum gallery. The letters spell one name in looping yellow script, Kutcher's. For more than half a century, the sign stood above a hotel where families ate kosher dinners, comedians tested jokes, boxers trained, and young Wilt Chamberlain worked as a bellhop. The hotel is gone. The sign still lights. Kutcher's had lasted longer than the other grand Jewish resorts. It began in 1907 as Kutcher's Brothers Farmhouse, another piece of Catskills land made more productive by beds than crops. Under Milton and Helen Kutcher, it expanded into a property of roughly 1,300 acres, with hundreds of rooms, bungalow colonies, camps, a lake, a golf course, and sports facilities. Even as its competitors closed, Kutcher's continued serving holiday guests, conventions, festivals, and returning families. The carpets aged, the guest wings emptied, the dining room remained ready. Helen Kutcher died in March 2013. That December, the property was sold for $8,180,000 to a company planning a health and wellness resort. Demolition began in 2014. A 6-story wellness center opened nearby 4 years later, offering yoga, massage, diet programs, and treatments drawn from Indian traditions. The land remained devoted to people leaving the city in search of restoration. The definition had changed. When Kutcher's closed, its neon sign was purchased at auction. It survived decades of mountain winters and even a hotel fire, then traveled south to Long Island, where it spent years in an East Meadow garage. It was too large to disappear into a closet and too specific to become ordinary decoration. Its metal casing, old transformers, and fragile glass tubes belonged to one building, one family, and one road through Sullivan County. Eventually, the sign returned to the Catskills. Its new home stands at 90 Canal Street in Ellenville, inside the Catskills Borscht Belt Museum. The building was constructed in 1928 for the Home National Bank, a brick Neo-Georgian structure designed to communicate solidity. Balanced windows, stone trim, a formal entrance, and a vault built to hold what depositors could not afford to lose. During the 1920s, 1930s, and 1940s, Home National was one of the few banks willing to lend money to Jewish hotel keepers and bungalow colony owners. Other institutions saw risky borrowers, seasonal businesses, and rocky land. Home National saw rooms that could be added, kitchens enlarged, plumbing installed, and mortgages repaid one summer at a time. The bank helped turn spare bedrooms into hotel wings. Now the hotel rooms have been brought back inside the bank. In its old vault, the museum has constructed a full-scale replica of a 1970s Kutcher's guest room, with the greens, yellows, furniture, and patterned surfaces of the period. A room once rented as part of a vacation package now sits within walls designed for cash and documents. Beyond the vault are menus, photographs, advertisements, postcards, recorded voices, and film from the resort years. A Kutcher's dinner menu still offers more food than one person could reasonably order. Images preserve swimming pools without cracks, dining rooms with every table set, and nightclubs before the lights went dark. Outside the museum, the physical Catskills carry the story less neatly. The Concorde's towers and 3,000-seat rooms were demolished. On part of the former property, the glass tower of Resorts World Catskills rises above a casino floor. Grossinger's closed in 1986. Most of its remaining structures were demolished in 2018, and fire destroyed another building in 2022. The Pines burned in 2023 after standing empty for years. At the Novelli, closed since 2009, fire swept through the Winter Building in March 2024, while other sections continued to deteriorate. Weather does patient work. Water enters roofs. Freeze and thaw widen cracks. Trees grow through tennis courts. Indoor pools collect leaves, plaster, and rain. The Jewish summer in the Catskills did not disappear with the grand hotels. Orthodox and Hasidic families continue traveling north from New York City. Bungalow colonies open for the season. Camps occupy former resort properties. Screened porches, small kitchens, children on bicycles, and fathers arriving before the Sabbath preserve parts of a pattern older than the hotel towers. The crowds are different. The roads remember the traffic. The museum itself grew from another form of return. Historians, photographers, former workers, hotel families, and local residents began collecting what demolition crews and weather had left behind. Historical markers appeared near former resort sites. A sculpture was pulled from a doomed building. Paper records came out of attics. The Kutcher's sign came out of its garage. When workers installed the sign above the museum's main gallery, the neon still functioned. Then it flickered and failed. No repair company wanted to travel to Ellenville for the job. The sign remained dark until Billy Rosenblatt walked into the museum. Rosenblatt had begun working in Catskills hotels when he was 14. Later, on Long Island, he built a career in commercial signs and became known as the Neon King. He had not repaired neon in 20 years, but he climbed a ladder and began working through the Kutcher's sign's old transformers and wiring. In October 2025, the yellow script came back on. After the museum closes, the replica hotel room remains inside the vault. The menus lie flat behind glass. Outside, cars pass along Canal Street, no longer carrying entire households toward 8-week vacations. Above the gallery, the Kutcher's sign throws its yellow light across the old bank wall. It once called to motorists from the road, promising beds, dinner, dancing, and a place where the door would open. It is no longer pointing anywhere. It is simply lit.